of her gift. And I thank you very much for telling me of it." Madame Laurin bent and kissed little Joyce's brown cheek. "Little gypsy, goodbye. But come every day to this hotel to see me. And next summer I shall be back. I like you, because someday you will be a great singer, and because today you are a loving, unselfish baby." "You have forgotten the little black doll, Madam," said little Joyce gravely. Madam threw up her hands, laughing. "No, no, I shall not take your little black doll of the 4,000 years. Keep it for a mascot. A great singer always needs a mascot. But do not, I command you, take it out of the box till I am gone, for if I were to see it again, I might not be able to resist the temptation. Some day I shall show you my dolls, but there is not such a gem among them." When Madame Laurin had gone, Grandmother Marshall looked at little Joyce. "Come to my room, Joyce. I want to see if we cannot find a more becoming way of arranging your hair. It has grown so thick and long. I had no idea how thick and long. Yes, we must certainly find a better way than that stiff braid. Come." Little Joyce, taking Grandmother Marshall's extended hand, felt very happy. She realized that this strange, stately old lady, who never liked little girls unless they were pretty or graceful or clever, was beginning to love her at last. The man on the train, to see, when the telegram came from William George, Grandma Sheldon was all alone with Cyrus and Louise. And Cyrus and Louise, aged respectively 12 and 11, were not very much good, Grandma thought, when it came to advising what was to be done. Grandma was all in a flutter, "Dear, oh dear," as she said. The telegram said that Delia, William George's wife, was seriously ill down at Green Village, and William George wanted Samuel to bring Grandma down immediately. Delia had always thought there was nobody like Grandma when it came to nursing sick folks. But Samuel and his wife were both away, had been away for 2 days and intended to be away for 5 more. They had driven to Sinclair, 20 miles away, to visit with Mrs. Samuel's folks for a week. "Dear, oh dear, what shall I do?" said Grandma. "Go right to Green Village on the evening train," said Cyrus briskly. "Dear, oh dear, and leave you two alone," cried Grandma. "Louise and I will do very well until tomorrow," said Cyrus sturdily. "We will send word to Sinclair by today's mail, and Father and Mother will be home by tomorrow night." "But I never was on the cars in my life," protested Grandma nervously. I'm so frightened to start alone. And you never know what kind of people you may meet on the train." "You'll be all right, Grandma. I'll drive you to the station, get you your ticket, and put you on the train. Then you'll have nothing to do until the train gets to Green Village. I'll send a telegram to Uncle William George to meet you." "I shall fall and break my neck getting off the train," said Grandma pessimistically. But she was wondering at the same time whether she had better take the black valise or the yellow, and whether William George would be likely to have plenty of flaxseed in the house. It was 6 miles to the station, and Cyrus drove Grandma over in time to catch a train that reached Green Village at 9 o'clock. "Dear, oh dear," said Grandma, "what if William George's folks ain't there to meet me?" "It's all very well, Cyrus, to say that they will be there, but you don't know. And it's all very well to say not to be nervous because everything will be all right. If you were 75 years old and had never set foot on the cars in your life, you'd be nervous too, and you can't be sure that everything will be all right. You never know what sort of people you'll meet on the train. I may get on the wrong train or lose my ticket or get carried past Green Village or get my pocket picked. Well, no, I won't do that, for not 1 cent will I carry with me. You shall take back home all the money you don't need to get my ticket. Then I shall be easier in my mind. Dear, oh dear, if it wasn't that Delia is so seriously ill I wouldn't go 1 step." "Oh, you'll be all right," Grandma assured Cyrus. He got Grandma's ticket for her and Grandma tied it up in the corner of her handkerchief. Then the train came in and Grandma, clinging closely to Cyrus, was put on it. Cyrus found a comfortable seat for her and shook hands cheerily. "Goodbye, Grandma. Don't be frightened. Here's the Weekly Argus. I got it at the store. You may like to look over it." Then Cyrus was gone, and in a minute the station house and platform began to glide away. "Dear, oh dear, what has happened to it?" thought Grandma in dismay. The next moment she exclaimed aloud, "Why, it's us that's moving, not it." Some of the passengers smiled pleasantly at Grandma. She was the variety of old lady at which people do smile pleasantly, a grandma with round, pink cheeks, soft, brown eyes, and lovely snow-white curls is a nice person to look at wherever she is found. After a while Grandma, to her amazement, discovered that she liked riding on the cars. It was not at all the disagreeable experience she had expected it to be. Why, she was just as comfortable as if she were in her own rocking chair at home. And there was such a lot of people to look at, and many of the ladies had such beautiful dresses and hats. After all, the people you met on a train, thought Grandma, are surprisingly like the people you meet off it. If it had not been for wondering how she would get off at Green Village, Grandma would have enjoyed herself thoroughly. 4 or 5 stations farther on the train halted at a lonely-looking place consisting of the station house and a barn, surrounded by scrub woods and blueberry barrens. One passenger got on and, finding only one vacant seat in the crowded car, sat right down beside Grandma Sheldon. Grandma Sheldon held her breath while she looked him over. Was he a pickpocket? He didn't appear like one, but you can never be sure of the people you meet on the train. Grandma remembered with a sigh of thankfulness that she had no money. Besides, he seemed really very respectable and harmless. He was quietly dressed in a suit of dark blue serge with a black overcoat. He wore his hat well down on his forehead and was clean-shaven. His hair was very black, but his eyes were blue, nice eyes, Grandma thought. She always felt great confidence in a man who had bright, open, blue eyes. Grandpa Sheldon, who had died so long ago, 4 years after their marriage, had had bright blue eyes. To be sure, he had fair hair, reflected Grandma. It's real odd to see such black hair with such light blue eyes. Well, he's real nice looking, and I don't believe there's a mite of harm in him. The early autumn night had now fallen and Grandma could not amuse herself by watching the scenery. She bethought herself of the paper Cyrus had given her and took it out of her basket. It was an old weekly a fortnight back. On the first page was a long account of a murder case with scareheads, and into this Grandma plunged eagerly. Sweet old Grandma Sheldon, who would not have harmed a fly and hated to see even a mousetrap set, simply reveled in the newspaper accounts of murders. And the more shocking and cold-blooded they were, the more eagerly did Grandma read of them. This murder story was particularly good from Grandma's point of view. It was full of thrills. A man had been shot down, apparently in cold blood, and his supposed murderer was still at large and had eluded all the efforts of justice to capture him. His name was Mark Hartwell, and he was described as a tall, fair man, with full auburn beard and curly, light hair. "What a shocking thing," said Grandma aloud. Her companion looked at her with a kindly, amused smile. "What is it?" he asked. "Why, this murder at Charlottesville," answered Grandma, forgetting, in her excitement, that it was not safe to talk to people you meet on the train. "It just makes my blood run cold to read about it. And to think that the man who did it is still around the country somewhere, plotting other murders, I haven't a doubt. What is the good of the police? They're dull fellows," agreed the dark man. "But I don't envy that man his conscience," said Grandma solemnly, and somewhat inconsistently, in view of her statement about the other murders that were being plotted. "What must a man feel like who has the blood of a fellow creature on his hands? Depend upon it, his punishment has begun already, caught or not." "That is true," said the dark man quietly. "Such a good-looking man too," said Grandma, looking wistfully at the murderer's picture. "It doesn't seem possible that he can have killed anybody. But the paper says there isn't a doubt." "He is probably guilty," said the dark man, "but nothing is known of his provocation. The affair may not have been so cold-blooded as the accounts state. Those newspaper fellows never err on the side of undercoloring. I really think," said Grandma slowly, "that I would like to see a murderer, just one." Whenever I say anything like that, Adelaide is Samuel's wife, looks at me as if she thought there was something wrong about me. And perhaps there is, but I do, all the same. When I was a little girl, there was a man in our settlement who was suspected of poisoning his wife. She died very suddenly. I used to look at him with such interest. But it wasn't satisfactory, because you could never be sure whether he was really guilty or not. I never could believe that he was, because he was such a nice man in some ways and so good and kind to children. I don't believe a man who was bad enough to poison his wife could have any good in him. Perhaps not, agreed the dark man. He had absent-mindedly folded up Grandma's old copy of the Argus and put it in his pocket. Grandma did not like to ask him for it, although she would have liked to see if there were any more murder stories in it. Besides, just at that moment the conductor came around for tickets. Grandma looked in the basket for her handkerchief. It was not there. She looked on the floor and on the seat and under the seat. It was not there. She stood up and shook herself, still no handkerchief. Dear, oh dear, exclaimed Grandma wildly, I've lost my ticket. I always knew I would. I told Cyrus I would. Oh, where can it be? The conductor scowled unsympathetically. The dark man got up and helped Grandma search, but no ticket was to be found. You'll have to pay the money then, and something extra, said the conductor gruffly. I can't, I haven't a cent of money, wailed Grandma. I gave it all to Cyrus because I was afraid my pocket would be picked. Oh, what shall I do? Don't worry. I'll make it all right, said the dark man. He took out his pocketbook and handed the conductor a bill. That functionary grumblingly made the change and marched onward, while Grandma, pale with excitement and relief, sank back into her seat. I can't tell you how much I am obliged to you, sir, she said tremulously. I don't know what I should have done. Would he have put me off right here in the snow? I hardly think he would have gone to such lengths, said the dark man with a smile. But he's a cranky, disobliging fellow enough, I know him of old. And you must not feel overly grateful to me. I am glad of the opportunity to help you. I had an old grandmother myself once, he added with a sigh. You must give me your name and address, of course, said Grandma, and my son, Samuel Sheldon of Midvan, will see that the money is returned to you. Well, this is a lesson to me. I'll never trust myself on a train again, and all I wish is that I was safely off this one. This fuss has worked my nerves all up again. Don't worry, Grandma. I'll see you safely off the train when we get to Green Village. Will you, though? Will you, now, said Grandma eagerly. I'll be real easy in my mind, then she added with a returning smile. I feel as if I could trust you for anything, and I'm a real suspicious person too. They had a long talk after that, or, rather, Grandma talked and the dark man listened and smiled. She told him all about William George and Delia and their baby, and about Samuel and Adelaide and Cyrus and Louise and the 3 cats and the parrot. He seemed to enjoy her accounts of them too. When they reached Green Village Station, he gathered up Grandma's parcels and helped her tenderly off the train. Anybody here to meet Mrs. Sheldon? He asked of the station master. The latter shook his head. Don't think so. Haven't seen anybody here to meet anybody tonight. Dear, oh dear, said poor Grandma. This is just what I expected. They've never got Cyrus's telegram. Well, I might have known it. What shall I do?" "How far is it to your son's?" asked the dark man. "Only half a mile, just over the hill there." "But I'll never get there alone this dark night." "Of course not. But I'll go with you. The road is good, we'll do finely." "But that train won't wait for you," gasped Grandma, half in protest. "It doesn't matter. The Starmont freight passes here in half an hour and I'll go on her." "Come along, Grandma." "Oh, but you're good," said Grandma. "Some woman is proud to have you for a son." The man did not answer. He had not answered any of the personal remarks Grandma had made to him in her conversation. They were not long in reaching William George Sheldon's house, for the village road was good and Grandma was smart on her feet. She was welcomed with eagerness and surprise. "To think that there was no one to meet you," exclaimed William George. "But I never dreamed of your coming by train, knowing how you were set against it." "Telegram?" "No, I got no telegram. Suppose Cyrus forgot to send it." "I'm most heartily obliged to you, sir, for looking after my mother so kindly." "It was a pleasure," said the dark man courteously. He had taken off his hat, and they saw a curious scar, shaped like a large, red butterfly, high up on his forehead under his hair. "I am delighted to have been of any assistance to her." He would not wait for supper, the next train would be in and he must not miss it. "There are people looking for me," he said with his curious smile. "They will be much disappointed if they do not find me." He had gone, and the whistle of the Starmont freight had blown before Grandma remembered that he had not given her his name and address. "Dear, oh dear, how are we ever going to send that money to him?" she exclaimed. "And he's so nice and good-hearted." Grandma worried over this for a week in the intervals of looking after Delia. One day William George came in with a large city daily in his hands. He looked curiously at Grandma and then showed her the front page picture of a man, clean-shaven, with an oddly shaped scar high up on his forehead. "Did you ever see that man, Mother?" he asked. "Of course I did," said Grandma excitedly. "Why, it's the man I met on the train." "Who is he? What is his name?" "Now, we'll know where to send. That is Mark Hartwell, who shot Amos Gray at Charlottesville 3 weeks ago," said William George quietly. Grandma looked at him blankly for a moment. "It couldn't be," she gasped at last. "That man a murderer? I'll never believe it." "It's true enough, Mother. The whole story is here." He had shaved his beard and dyed his hair and came near getting clear out of the country. They were on his trail the day he came down in the train with you and lost it because of his getting off to bring you here. His disguise was so perfect that there was little fear of his being recognized so long as he hid that scar. But it was seen in Montreal and he was run to earth there. He has made a full confession." "I don't care," cried Grandma valiantly. "I'll never believe he was all bad, a man who would do what he did for a poor old woman like me, when he was flying for his life too. No, no, there was good in him even if he did kill that man. And I'm sure he must feel terrible over it. In this view Grandma persisted. She never would say or listen to a word against Mark Hartwell, and she had only pity for him whom everyone else condemned. With her own trembling hands she wrote him a letter to accompany the money Samuel sent before Hartwell was taken to the penitentiary for life. She thanked him again for his kindness to her and assured him that she knew he was sorry for what he had done and that she would pray for him every night of her life. Mark Hartwell had been hard and defiant enough, but the prison officials told that he cried like a child over Grandma Sheldon's little letter. "There's nobody all bad," says Grandma when she relates the story. "I used to believe a murderer must be, but I know better now. I think of that poor man often and often. He was so kind and gentle to me, he must have been a good boy once. I write him a letter every Christmas and I send him tracts and papers. He's my own little charity. But I've never been on the cars since and I never will be again. You never can tell what will happen to you or what sort of people you'll meet if you trust yourself on a train." The Romance of Jedediah. To see, Jedediah was not a name that savored of romance. His last name was Crane, which is little better. And it would be no use to call this story Matty Adams's Romance because Matty Adams is not a romantic name either. But names have really nothing to do with romance. The most exciting and tragic affair I ever knew was between a man named Silas Putdammer and a woman named Kezia Cullen, which has nothing to do with the present story. Jedediah, to all outward seeming, did not appear to be any more romantic than his name. He looked distinctly commonplace as he rode comfortably along the winding country road that was dreaming in the haze and sunshine of a midsummer afternoon. He was perched on the seat of a bright red peddler's wagon, above and behind a dusty, ambling, red pony of that peculiar gait and appearance pertaining to the ponies of country peddlers, a certain placid, unhasting leanness, as of a nag that has encountered troubles of his own and has lived them down by sheer patience and staying power. From the bright red wagon proceeded a certain metallic rumbling and clinking as it bowled along, and 2 or 3 nests of tin pans on its flat rope-encircled top flashed back the light so dazzlingly that Jedediah seemed the beaming sun of a little planetary system all his own. A new broom sticking up aggressively at each of the 4 corners gave the wagon a resemblance to a triumphal chariot. Jedediah himself had not been in the tin peddling business long enough to acquire the apologetic, out-at-elbows appearance which distinguishes a tin peddler from other kinds of peddlers. In fact, this was his maiden venture in this line, hence he still looked plump and self-respecting. He had a round red face under his plug hat, twinkling blue eyes, and a little pursed-up mouth, the shape of which was partly due to nature and partly to much whistling. Jedediah's pudgy body was clothed in a suit of large, light checks, and he wore a bright pink necktie and an amethyst pin. Will I still be believed when I assert that, in spite of all this, Jedediah was full of, and bubbling over with, romance? Romance cares not for appearances and apparently delights in contradictions. The homely shambling man you pass unnoticed on the street may have, tucked away in his past, a story more exciting and thrilling than anything you have ever read in fiction. So it was, in a measure, with Jedediah, poor, unknown to fame, afflicted with a double chin and bald spot, reduced to driving a tin wagon for a living. He yet had his romance, and he was still romantic. As Jedediah rode through Amberley he looked about him with interest. He knew it well, although it was 15 years since he had seen it. He had been born and brought up in Amberley. He had left it at the age of 25 to make his fortune. But Amberley was Amberley still. Jedediah found it hard to believe that it or himself was 15 years older. "There's the Stanton place," he said. "Charlie has painted the house yellow, it used to be white, and Bob Holman has cut the trees down behind the blacksmith forge." Bob never had any poetry in his soul, no romance, as you might say. He was what you might call a plodder, you might call him that. "Get up, my nag, get up. There's the old Harkis place, seems to be spruced up considerable. Folks used to say if ye wanted to see how the world looked the morning after the flood, just go into George Harkis's barnyard on a rainy day. The pond and the old hills ain't changed any. Get up, my nag, get up. There's the Adams homestead. Do I really behold it again?" Jedediah thought the moment deliciously romantic. He reveled in it and, to match his exhilarated mood, he touched the pony with his whip and went clinking and glittering down the hill under the poplars at a dashing rate. He had not intended to offer his wares in Amberley that day. He meant to break the ice in Occidental, the village beyond. But he could not pass the Adams place. When he came to the open gate he turned in under the willows and drove down the wide, shady lane, girt on both sides with a trim white paling smothered in lavish sweetbrier bushes that were gay with bloom. Jedediah's heart was beating furiously under his checks. "What a fool you are, Jed Crane," he told himself. "You used to be a young fool, and now you're an old one. Sad, that. Get up, my nag, get up. It's a poor lookout for a man of your years, Jed. Don't get excited. It ain't the least likely that Mattie Adams is here yet. She's married and gone years ago, no doubt. It's probable there's no Adamses here at all now. But it's romantic, yes, it's romantic. It's splendid. Get up, my nag, get up." The Adams place itself was not unromantic. The house was a large, old-fashioned white one, with green shutters and a front porch with Grecian columns. These were thought very elegant in Amberley. Mrs. Carmody said they gave a house such a classical air. In this instance the classical effect was somewhat smothered in honeysuckle, which rioted over the whole porch and hung in pale yellow, fragrant festoons over the rows of potted scarlet geraniums that flanked the green steps. Beyond the house a low-boughed orchard covered the slope between it and the main road, and behind it there was a revel of color betokening a flower garden. Jedediah climbed down from his lofty seat and walked dubiously to a side door that looked more friendly, despite its prim screen, than the classical front porch. As he drew near he saw a woman sitting behind the screen, a woman who rose as he approached and opened the door. Jedediah's heart had been beating a wild tattoo as he crossed the yard. It now stopped altogether, at least he declared in later years it did. The woman was Mattie Adams, 15 years older than when he had seen her last, plumper, rosier, somewhat broader-faced, but still unmistakably Mattie Adams. Jedediah felt that the situation was delicious. "Mattie," he said, holding out his hand. "Why, Jed, how are you?" said Mattie, as if they had parted the week before. It had always taken a great deal to disturb Mattie. Whatever happened, she was calm. Even an old lover, and the only one she had ever possessed at that, dropping, so to speak, from the skies, after 15 years' disappearance, did not ruffle her placidity. "I didn't suppose you'd know me," Mattie said. Jedediah, still holding her hand foolishly. "I knew you the minute I set eyes on you," returned Mattie. "You're some fatter and older, like myself, but you're Jed still. Where have you been all these years?" "Pretty near everywhere, Mattie, pretty near everywhere. And ye see what it's come to, here I be driving a tin wagon for Boone Brothers. Business is business, don't you want to buy some new tinware?" To himself, Jed thought it was romantic, asking a woman whom he had loved all his life to buy tins on the occasion of their first meeting after 15 years' separation. "I don't know, but I do want a quart measure," said Mattie, in her sweet, unchanged voice, "but all in good time. You must stay and have tea with me, Jed. I'm all alone now, Mother and Father have gone. Unhitch your horse and put him in the third stall in the stable." Jed hesitated. "I ought to be getting on, I suppose," he said wistfully. "I hain't done much today." "You must stay to tea," interrupted Mattie. "Why, Jed, there's ever so much to tell and ask. And we can't stand here in the yard and talk. Look at Selina. There she is, watching us from the kitchen window. She'll watch as long as we stand here." Jed swung himself around. Over the little valley below the Adams homestead was a steep, treeless hill, and on its crest was perched a bare farmhouse with windows stuck lavishly all over it. At one of them a long, pale face was visible. "Has Selina been pasted up at that window ever since the last time we stood here and talked, Mattie?" asked Jed, half resentfully, half amusedly. It was characteristic of Mattie to laugh first at the question, and then blush over the memory it revived. "Most of the time, I guess," she said shortly. "But come in. I never could talk under Selina's eyes, even if they were 400 yards away." Jed went in and stayed to tea. The old Adams pantry had not failed, nor apparently the Adams' skill in cooking. After tea Jed hung around till sunset and drove away with a warm invitation from Mattie to call every time his rounds took him through Amberley. As he went, Selina's face appeared at the window of the house over the valley. When he had gone, Mattie went around to the classical porch and sat herself down under the honeysuckle festoons that dangled above her smooth braids of fawn-colored hair. She knew Selina would be down-postast presently, agog with curiosity to find out who the peddler was whom Mattie had delighted to honor with an invitation to tea. Mattie preferred to meet Selina out of doors. It was easier to thrust and parry there. Meanwhile, she wanted to think over things. 15 years before Jedediah Crane had been Mattie Adams's beau. Jedediah was romantic even then, but, as he was a slim young fellow at the time, with an abundance of fair, curly hair and innocent blue eyes, his romance was rather an attraction than not. At least the then young and pretty Mattie had found it so. The Adamses looked with no favor on the match. They were a thrifty, well-to-do folk. As for the Cranes, well, they were lazy and shiftless, for the most part. It would be a mésalliance for an Adams to marry a Crane. Still, it would doubtless have happened, for Mattie, though a meek-looking damsel, had a mind of her own, had it not been for Selina Ford, Mattie's older sister. Selina, people said, had married James Ford for no other reason than that his house commanded a view of nearly every dooryard in Amberley. This may or may not have been sheer malice. Certainly nothing that went on in the Adams yard escaped Selina. She watched Mattie and Jed in the moonlight one night. She saw Jed kiss Mattie. It was the first time he had ever done so, and the last, poor fellow. For Selina swooped down on her parents the next day. Such a storm did she brew up that Mattie was forbidden to speak to Jed again. Selina herself gave Jed a piece of her mind. Jed usually was not afflicted with undue sensitiveness. But he had some slumbering pride at the basis of his character, and it was very stubborn when roused. Selina roused it. Jed vowed he would never creep and crawl at the feet of the Adamses, and he went west forthwith, determined, as aforesaid, to make his fortune and hurl Selina's scorn back in her face. And now he had come home, driving a tin wagon. Mattie smiled to think of it. She bore Jed no ill will for his failure. She felt sorry for him and inclined to think that fate had used him hardly, fate and Selina together. Mattie had never had another beau. People thought she was engaged to Jed Crane until her time for beaux went by. Mattie did not mind, she had never liked anybody so well as Jed. To be sure, she had not thought of him for years. It was strange he should come back like this, romantic as he said himself. Mattie's reverie was interrupted by Selina. Angular, pale-eyed Mrs. Ford was as unlike the plump, rosy Mattie as a sister could be. Perhaps her chronic curiosity, which would not let her rest, was accountable for her excessive leanness. "Who was that peddler that was here this afternoon, Mattie?" she demanded as soon as she arrived. Mattie smiled. "Jed Crane," she said. "He's home from the west and driving a tin wagon for the Boones." Selina gave a little gasp. She sat down on the lowest step and untied her bonnet strings. Matty Adams. And you kept him hanging about the whole afternoon. Why not? Said Matty wickedly. She liked to alarm Selina. Jed and I were always beaux, you know. Matty Adams. You don't mean to say you're going to make a fool of yourself over Jed Crane again? A woman of your age. Don't get excited, Selina implored Matty. In the old days Selina could cow her, but that time was past. I never saw the like of you for getting stirred up over nothing. I'm not excited. I'm perfectly calm. But I might well be excited over your folly, Matty Adams. The idea of your taking up again with old Jed Crane. He's 15 years younger than Jim, said Matty, giving thrust for thrust. When Selina had come over, Matty had not the slightest idea of resuming her former relationship with the romantic Jedediah. She had merely shown him kindness for old friendship's sake. But so well did the unconscious Selina work in Jed's behalf that when she flounced off home in a pet, Matty was resolved that she would take Jed back if he wanted to come. She wasn't going to put up with Selina's everlasting interference. She would show her that she was independent. When a week had passed, Jed came again. He sold Matty a stew pan and he would not go in to tea this time, but they stood and talked in the yard for the best part of an hour, while Selina glared at them from her kitchen window. Their conversation was most innocent and harmless, being mainly gossip about what had come and gone during Jed's exile. But Matty knew that Selina thought that she and Jed were making love to each other in this shameless, public fashion. When Jed went, Matty, more for Selina's benefit than his, broke off some sprays of honeysuckle and pinned them on his coat. The fragrance went with Jedediah as he drove through Amberley, and pleasant thoughts were born of it. It's romantic, he told the pony. Blessed if it ain't romantic. Not that Matty cares anything about me now. I know she don't. But it's just her kind way. She wants to cheer me up and let me know I've a friend still. Get up, my nag, get up. I ain't one to pursue 'em on her kindness neither, I know my place. But still, say what you will, it's romantic, this situation. This is it. Here I be, loving the ground she walks on, as I've always done, and I can't let on that I do because I'm a poor ne'er-do-well as ain't fit to look at her, an independent woman with property. And she's a showing kindness to me for old time's sake, and piercing my heart all the time, not knowing. Why, it's romance with a vengeance, that's what it is. Get up, my nag, get up. Thereafter Jed called at the Adams place every week. Generally he stayed to tea. Matty always bought something of him to colour an excuse. Her kitchen fairly glittered with new tinware. She gave Selina the overflow by way of heaping coals of fire. After every visit Jedediah held stern counsel with himself and decided that he must not call to see Matty again, at least, not for a long time, then he must not stay to tea. He would struggle with himself all the way down the Poplar Hill, not without a comforting sense of the romance of the struggle, but it always ended the same way. He turned in under the willows and clinked musically into Matty's yard. At least, the rattle of the tin wagons sounded musically to Matty. Meanwhile, Selina watched from her window and raged. Amberley people shrugged their shoulders when gossip noised the matter abroad. But, being good-humoured in the main, they forbore to do more than say that Matty Adams was free to make a goose of herself if it pleased her, and that Jed Crane wasn't such a fool as he looked. The Adams farm was one of the best in Amberley, and it had not grown any poorer under Matty's management. If Jed walks in there and hangs up his hat, he'll have done well for himself after all. This was Selina's view of it also, barring the good nature. She was furious at the whole affair, and she did her best to make Matty's life a burden to her with slurs and thrusts. But they all misjudged Jed. He had no intention of walking in and hanging up his hat, or trying to. Romantic as he was, it never occurred to him that Matty might be as romantic as himself. She did not care for him, and anyhow he, Jed, had a little too much pride to ask her, a rich woman, to marry him, a poor man who had lost all caste he ever possessed by taking up tin peddling. Jed was determined not to pursue him. And, oh, how deliciously romantic it all was. He hugged himself with sorrowful delight over it. As the summer waned and the long yellow leaves began to fall thickly from the willows in the Adams Lane, Jed began to talk of going out west again. Tin peddling was not possible in winter, and he didn't think he would try it another summer. Matty listened with dismay in her heart. All summer she had made much of Jed, by way of tormenting Selina. But now she realized what he really meant to her. The old love had wakened to life in her heart. She could not let Jed go out of her life again, leaving her to the old loneliness. If Jed went away, everything would be flat, stale, and unprofitable. She knew him to be at heart the kindest, most gentle of human beings, and the mere fact of his having been unsuccessful, even what some of his old neighbors might call stupid, did not change her feelings toward him in the least. He was Jed, that was sufficient for her, and she had business capability enough for both, when it came to that. Matty began to drop hints. But Jed would not take them. True, once or twice he thought that perhaps Matty did care a little for him yet. But it would not do for him to take advantage of that. No, I just couldn't do that, he told the pony. I worship the ground that woman treads on, but it ain't for the likes of me to tell her so, not now. Get up, my nag, get up. This has been a mighty pleasant summer with that visit to look forward to every week. But it's about over now and you must tramp, Jed. Jed sighed. He remembered that it was more romantic than ever, but all at once this failed to comfort him. Romance up to a certain point was food, beyond that it palled, so to speak. Jed's romance failed him just when he needed it most. Matty, meanwhile, was forced to the dismal conclusion that her hints were thrown away. Jed was plainly determined not to speak. Matty felt half angry with him. She did not choose to make a martyr of herself to romance, and surely the man didn't expect her to ask him to marry her. I'm sure and certain he's as fond of me as ever he was, she mused. I suppose he's got some ridiculous notion about being too poor to aspire to me. Jed always had more pride than a crane could carry. Well, I've done all I can, all I'm going to do. If Jed's determined to go, he must go, I suppose. Matty would not let herself cry, although she felt like it. She went out and picked apples instead. Matty might have remained so and Jedediah's romance might never have reached a better ending, if it had not been for Selina, who came over just then to help Matty pick the golden russets. Fate had evidently destined her as Jed's best helper. All summer she had been fairly goading Matty into love with Jedediah, and now she was moved to add the last spur. Jed Crane's going away, I hear, she said maliciously. Seems to me you're bound to be jilted again, Matty. Matty had no answer ready. Selina went on undauntedly. You've made a nice fool of yourself all summer, I vow. Throwing yourself at Jed's head, and he doesn't want you, even with all your property. He does want me, said Matty calmly. Her lips were very firm and her cheeks scarlet. He is not going away. We are to be married about Christmas, and Jed will take charge of the farm for me. Matilda Adams, said Selina. It was all she was capable of saying. The rest of the golden russets were picked in a dead silence, Matty working with an unusually high color in her cheeks, while Selina's thin lips were pressed so closely together as to be little else than a hairline. After Selina had gone home, sulking, Matty picked on with a very determined face. The die was cast, she could not bear Selina's slurs and she would not. And she had not told a lie either. Her words were true, she would make them true. All the Adams' determination, and that was not a little, was roused in her. If Jed jilts me, he'll do it to my face, clean and clever, she said viciously. When Jed came again he was very solemn. He thought it would be his last visit, but Matty felt differently. She had dressed herself with unusual care and crimped her hair. Her cheeks were scarlet and her eyes bright. Jed thought she looked younger and prettier than ever. The thought that this was the last time he would see her for many a long day to come grew more and more unbearable. Yet he firmly determined he would let no presuming word pass his lips. Matty had been so kind to him. It was only honorable of him in return not to let her throw herself away on a poor failure like himself. I suppose this is your last round with the wagon, she said. She had taken him out into the garden to say it. The garden was out of view from the Ford place. Propose she must, but she drew the line at proposing under Selina's eyes. Jed nodded dully. Yes, and then I must toddle off and look for something else to do. You see, I haven't much of a gift, so to speak, for business, Matty. And it takes me so long to get worked into an understanding of a business or trade that I'm generally asked to quit before you might say I've really commenced. It's been a mighty happy summer for me, though I can't say I've done much in the selling line except to you, Matty. What with your kindness and these little visits you've been good enough to let me make every week, I feel I may say it's been the happiest summer of my life, and I'm never going to forget it. But as I said, it's time for me to be moving on elsewhere and finding something else to do. There is something for you to do right here, if you will do it, said Matty faintly. For a moment she felt as if she could not go on. Jed and the garden and the scarf of late asters whirled around her dizzily. She held by the sweet pea trellis to steady herself. I said a terrible thing to Selina the other day. I don't know what I'll do about it if you don't help me out, Jed. I'll do anything I can, said Jed, with hearty sympathy. You know that, Matty. What is the trouble? His kindly voice and the goodwill and affection beaming in his honest blue eyes gave Matty renewed courage to go on with her self-imposed and most embarrassing task, although before she ended her voice shook and dwindled away to such a low whisper that Jed had to bend his head close to hers to hear what she was saying. I said, she goaded me into saying it, Jed, slighting and slurring, jeering at me because you were going away. I just got mad, Jed, and I told her you weren't going, that you and that we were to be married. Matty, did you mean that? He cried. If you did, I'm the happiest man alive. I didn't dare pursue 'em, I didn't suppose you thought anything of me. But if you do, and if you want me, here's all there is of me, heart and soul and body, forever and ever, as I've been all my life. Thinking over this speech afterwards, Jed was dissatisfied with it. He thought he might have made it much more eloquent and romantic than it was. But it served the purpose very well. It was convincing, it came straight from his honest, stupid heart, and Matty knew it. She held out her hands and Jed gathered her into his arms. It was certainly a most fortunate circumstance that the garden was well out of the range of Selina's vision, or the sight of her sister and the remaining member of the despised Crane family repeating their foolish performance, which many years previous had resulted in Jed's long banishment, might have caused her to commit almost any unheard of act of spite as an outlet for her jealous anger. But only the few remaining garden flowers were witness to the lovers' indiscretion, and they kept their own counsel after the manner of flowers, so Selina's feelings were mercifully spared this further outrage. That evening Jed drove slowly away through the twilight, mounted for the last time on the tin wagon. He was so happy that he bore no grudge against even Selina Ford. As the pony climbed the poplar hill, Jed drew a long breath and freed his mind to the surrounding landscape and to his faithful and slow-plodding steed that had been one of the main factors in this love affair, having patiently carried him to and from the abode of his ladylove throughout the summer just past. Jedediah was as brimful of happiness as mortal man could be, and his rosy thoughts flowed forth in a kind of triumphant chant which would have driven Selina stark distracted had she been within hearing distance. What he said too was but a poor expression of what he thought, but to the trees and fields and pony he chanted, "Well, this is romance. What else would you call it now? Me, poor, scared to speak, and Matty ups and does it for me, bless her. Yes, I've been longing for romance all my life, and I've got it at last. None of your commonplace courtships for me, I always said. Them was my very words. And I guess this has been a little uncommon, I guess it has. Anyhow, I'm uncommon happy. I never felt so romantic before. Get up, my nag, get up. The tryst of the White Lady, to see, I wished ye dgit married, Roger said Catherine Ames. I'm getting too old to work, 70 last April, and who's going to look after ye when I'm gone? Git married, by, git married. Roger Temple winced. His aunt's harsh, disagreeable voice always jarred horribly on his sensitive nerves. He was fond of her after a fashion, but always that voice made him wonder if there could be anything harder to endure. Then he gave a bitter little laugh. Who'd have me, Aunt Catherine? He asked. Catherine Ames looked at him critically across the supper table. She loved him in her way, with all her heart, but she was not in the least blind to his defects. She did not mince matters with herself or with other people. Roger was a sallow, plain-featured fellow, small and insignificant-looking. And, as if this were not bad enough, he walked with a slight limp and had one thin shoulder a little higher than the other. Jarback Temple he had been called in school, and the name still clung to him. To be sure, he had very fine grey eyes, but their dreamy brilliance gave his dull face an uncanny look which girls did not like, and so made matters rather worse than better. Of course looks didn't matter so much in the case of a man. Steve Miller was homely enough, and all marked up with smallpox to boot. Yet he had got for wife the prettiest and smartest girl in South Bay. But Steve was rich. Roger was poor and always would be. He worked his stony little farm, from which his father and grandfather had wrested a fair living, after a fashion, but nature had not cut him out for a successful farmer. He hadn't the strength for it and his heart wasn't in it. He'd rather be hanging over a book. Catherine secretly thought Roger's matrimonial chances very poor, but it would not do to discourage the by. What he needed was spurring on. You'll get someone if ye don't fly too high, she announced loudly and cheerfully. Thar's always a gal or two here and thar that's glad to marry for a home. Tain't no use for you to be settin' your thoughts on anyone young and pretty. Ye wouldn't get her and ye'd be worse off if ye did. Your grandfather married for looks, and a nice useless wife he got, sick half her time. Get a good strong girl that ain't afraid of work, that'll hold things together when ye reading poetry, that's as much as you can expect. And the sooner the better. I'm done, last winter's rheumatiz has about finished me. And we can't afford hired help. Roger felt as if his raw, quivering soul were being seared. He looked at his aunt curiously, at her broad, flat face with the mole on the end of her dumpy nose, the bristling hairs on her chin, the wrinkled yellow neck, the pale, protruding eyes, the coarse, good-humored mouth. She was so extremely ugly, and he had seen her across the table all his life. For 25 years he had looked at her so. Must he continue to go on looking at ugliness in the shape of a wife all the rest of his life, he, who worshipped beauty in everything? "Did my mother look like you, Aunt Catherine?" he asked abruptly. His aunt stared, and snorted. Her snort was meant to express kindly amusement, but it sounded like derision and contempt. "Your ma wasn't so humly as me," she said cheerfully, "but she wa'n't no beauty either. None of the Temples was ever better looking than was necessary. We was workers. Your pa wa'n't bad looking. You're humlier than either of 'em. Some ways you take after your grandma, though she was counted pretty at one time. She was yaller and spindlin' like you, and you've got her eyes. What you're so interested in your ma's looks all at once for?" "I was wondering," said Roger coolly, "if father ever looked at her across the table and wished she were prettier." Catherine giggled. Her giggle was ugly and disagreeable like everything else about her. Everything except a certain odd, loving, loyal old heart buried deep in her bosom, for the sake of which Roger endured the giggle and all the rest. "Dessy he did, dessy he did. Men allies has a hankerin' for good looks. But you've got to cut your coat 'cording to your cloth. As for your poor ma, she didn't live long enough to git as ugly as me. When I come here to keep house for your pa, folks said as it wouldn't be long 'fore he married me. I wouldn't minded. But your pa never hinted it. S'pose he'd had enough of ugly women likely." Catherine snorted amiably again. Roger got up. He couldn't endure any more just then. He must escape. "Now you think over what I've said," his aunt called after him. "You've got to git a wife soon, however ye manage it. 'Twon't be so hard if ye're reasonable. Don't stay out as late as ye did last night. Ye coughed all night. Where was ye, down at the shore?" "No," said Roger, who always answered her questions even when he hated to. "I was down at Aunt Isabel's grave. Till 11 o'clock. Ye ain't wise. I dunno what hankering ye have after that unchancy place. I ain't been near it for 20 year. I wonder ye ain't scared. What'd ye think ye'd do if ye saw her ghost?" Catherine looked curiously at Roger. She was very superstitious and she believed firmly in ghosts, and saw no absurdity in her question. "I wish I could see it," said Roger, his great eyes flashing. He believed in ghosts too, at least in Isabel Temple's ghost. His uncle had seen it, his grandfather had seen it, he believed he would see it, the beautiful, bewitching, mocking, alluring ghost of lovely Isabel Temple. "Don't wish such stuff," said Catherine. "Nobody ain't never the same after they've seen her." Was Uncle different? Roger had come back into the kitchen and was looking curiously at his aunt. Difference rent. He was another man. He didn't even look the same. Sick eyes. allies looking past ye at something behind ye. They'd give anyone creeps. He never had any notion of flesh and blood women after that, said a man wouldn't, after seeing Isabel. His life was plumb ruined. Lucky he died young. I hated to be in the same room with him, he warn't canny, that was all there was to it. You keep away from that grave, you don't want to look odder than ye are by nature. And when ye get married, ye'll have to give up roamin' about half the night in graveyards. A wife wouldn't put up with it, as I've done. I'll never get as good a wife as you, Aunt Catherine, said Roger with a little whimsical smile that gave him the look of an amused gnome. Dessy, you won't. But someone ye have to have. Yn't ye try Lisa Adams? She might have ye, she's gettin' on. Lisa Adams. That's what I said. Ye needn't repeat it, Lisa Adams, as if I'd mentioned a hippopotamus. I get out of patience with ye. I believe in my heart ye think ye ought to get a wife that'd look like a picture. I do, Aunt Catherine. That's just the kind of wife I want, grace and beauty and charm. Nothing less than that will ever content me. Roger laughed bitterly again and went out. It was sunset. There was no work to do that night except to milk the cows, and his little homeboy could do that. He felt a glad freedom. He put his hand in his pocket to see if his beloved Wordsworth was there, and then he took his way across the fields, under a sky of purple and amber, walking quickly despite his limp. He wanted to get to some solitary place where he could forget Aunt Catherine and her abominable suggestions and escape into the world of dreams where he habitually lived and where he found the loveliness he had not found nor could hope to find in his real world. Roger's mother had died when he was 3 and his father when he was 8. His little, old, bedridden grandmother had lived until he was 12. He had loved her passionately. She had not been pretty in his remembrance, a tiny, shrunken, wrinkled thing, but she had beautiful grey eyes that never grew old and a soft, gentle voice, the only woman's voice he had ever heard with pleasure. He was very critical as regards women's voices and very sensitive to them. Nothing hurt him quite so much as an unlovely voice, not even unloveliness of face. Her death had left him desolate. She was the only human being who had ever understood him. He could never, he thought, have got through his tortured school days without her. After she died he would not go to school. He was not in any sense educated. His father and grandfather had been illiterate men and he had inherited their underdeveloped brain cells. But he loved poetry and read all he could get of it. It overlaid his primitive nature with a curious iridescence of fancy and furnished him with ideals and hungers his environment could never satisfy. He loved beauty in everything. Moonraces hurt him with their loveliness and he could sit for hours gazing at a white narcissus, much to his aunt's exasperation. He was solitary by nature. He felt horribly alone in a crowded building but never in the woods or in the wild places along the shore. It was because of this that his aunt could not get him to go to church, which was a horror to her orthodox soul. He told her he would like to go to church if it were empty, but he could not bear it when it was full of smug, ugly people. Most people, he thought, were ugly, though not so ugly as he was, and ugliness made him sick with repulsion. Now and then he saw a pretty girl at whom he liked to look, but he never saw one that wholly pleased him. To him, the homely, crippled, poverty-stricken Roger Temple, whom they all would have scorned, there was always a certain subtle something wanting, and the lack of it kept him heart whole. He knew that this probably saved him from much suffering, but for all that he regretted it. He wanted to love, even vainly. He wanted to experience this passion of which the poets sang so much. Without it he felt he lacked the key to a world of wonder. He even tried to fall in love. He went to church for several Sundays and sat where he could see beautiful Elsa Carey. She was lovely, it gave him pleasure to look at her. The gold of her hair was so bright and living, the pink of her cheek so pure, the curve of her neck so flawless, the lashes of her eyes so dark and silken. But he looked at her as at a picture. When he tried to think and dream of her, it bored him. Besides, he knew she had a rather nasal voice. He used to laugh sarcastically to himself over Elsa's feelings if she had known how desperately he was trying to fall in love with her and failing. Elsa, the Queen of Hearts, who believed she had only to look to reign. He gave up trying at last, but he still longed to love. He knew he would never marry, he could not marry plainness, and beauty would have none of him, but he did not want to miss everything, and he had moments when he was very bitter and rebellious because he felt he must miss it forever. He went straight to Isabel Temple's grave in the remote shore field of his farm. Isabel Temple had lived and died 80 years ago. She had been very lovely, very willful, very fond of playing with the hearts of men. She had married William Temple, the brother of his great-grandfather, and as she stood in her white dress beside her bridegroom, at the conclusion of the wedding ceremony, a jilted lover, crazed by despair, had entered the house and shot her dead. She had been buried in the shore field, where a square space had been diked off in the center for a burial lot because the church was then so far away. With the passage of years the lot had grown up so thickly with fir and birch and wild cherry that it looked like a compact grove. A winding path led through it to its heart where Isabel Temple's grave was, thickly overgrown with long, silken, pale green grass. Roger hurried along the path and sat down on the big grey boulder by the grave, looking about him with a long breath of delight. How lovely, and witching, and unearthly it was here. Little ferns were growing in the hollows and cracks of the big boulder where clay had lodged. Over Isabel Temple's crooked, lichened gravestone hung a young wild cherry in its delicate bloom. Above it, in a little space of sky left by the slender tree tops, was a young moon. It was too dark here after all to read Wordsworth, but that did not matter. The place, with its moist air, its tang of fir balsam, was like a perfumed room where a man might dream dreams and see visions. There was a soft murmur of wind in the boughs over him, and the faraway moan of the sea on the bar crept in. Roger surrendered himself utterly to the charm of the place. When he entered that grove, he had left behind the realm of daylight and things known and come into the realm of shadow and mystery and enchantment. Anything might happen, anything might be true. 80 long years had come and gone, but Isabel Temple, thus cruelly torn from life at the moment when it had promised her most, did not even yet rest calmly in her grave. Such at least was the story, and Roger believed it. It was in his blood to believe it. The Temples were a superstitious family, and there was nothing in Roger's upbringing to correct the tendency. His was not a skeptical or scientific mind. He was ignorant and poetical and credulous. He had always accepted unquestioningly the tale that Isabel Temple had been seen on earth long after the red clay was heaped over her murdered body. Her bridegroom had seen her, when he went to visit her on the eve of his second and unhappy marriage. His grandfather had seen her. His grandmother, who had told him Isabel's story, had told him this too, and believed it. She had added, with a bitterness foreign to his idea of her, that her husband had never been the same to her afterwards. His uncle had seen her, and had lived and died a haunted man. It was only to men the lovely, restless ghost appeared, and her appearance boded no good to him who saw. Roger knew this, but he had a curious longing to see her. He had never avoided her grave as others of his tribe did. He loved the spot, and he believed that sometime he would see Isabel Temple there. She came, so the story went, to one in each generation of the family. He gazed down at her sunken grave. A little wind, that came stealing along the floor of the grove, raised and swayed the long, hair-like grass on it, giving the curious suggestion of something prisoned under it trying to draw a long breath and float upward. Then, when he lifted his eyes again, he saw her. She was standing behind the gravestone, under the cherry tree, whose long white branches touched her head, standing there, with her head drooping a little, but looking steadily at him. It was just between dusk and dark now, but he saw her very plainly. She was dressed in white, with some filmy scarf over her head, and her hair hung in a dark heavy braid over her shoulder. Her face was small and ivory white, and her eyes were very large and dark. Roger looked straight into them and they did something to him, drew something out of him that was never to be his again, his heart, his soul. He did not know. He only knew that lovely Isabel Temple had now come to him and that he was hers forever. For a few moments that seemed years he looked at her, looked till the lure of her eyes drew him to his feet as a man rises in sleepwalking. As he slowly stood up, the low-hanging bough of a fir tree pushed his cap down over his face and blinded him. When he snatched it off, she was gone. Roger Temple did not go home that night till the spring dawn was in the sky. Catherine was sleepless with anxiety about him. When she heard him come up the stairs, she opened her door and peeped out. Roger went along the hall without seeing her. His brilliant eyes stared straight before him, and there was something in his face that made Catherine steal back to her bed with a little shiver of fear. He looked like his uncle. She did not ask him, when they met at breakfast, where or how he had spent the night. He had been dreading the question and was relieved beyond measure when it was not asked. But, apart from that, he was hardly conscious of her presence. He ate and drank mechanically and voicelessly. When he had gone out, Catherine wagged her uncomely grey head ominously. "He's bewitched," she muttered. "I know the signs. He's seen her, drat her. It's time she gave up that kind of work." "Well, I dunno what to do, there ain't anything I can do, I reckon. He'll never marry now, I'm as sure of that as of any mortal thing. He's in love with a ghost." It had not yet occurred to Roger that he was in love. He thought of nothing but Isabel Temple, her lovely, lovely face, sweeter than any picture he had ever seen or any ideal he had dreamed, her long dark hair, her slim form and, more than all, her compelling eyes. He saw them wherever he looked, they drew him, he would have followed them to the end of the world, heedless of all else. He longed for night, that he might again steal to the grave in the haunted grove. She might come again, who knew? He felt no fear, nothing but a terrible hunger to see her again. But she did not come that night, nor the next, nor the next. 2 weeks went by and he had not seen her. Perhaps he would never see her again. The thought filled him with anguish not to be borne. He knew now that he loved her, Isabel Temple, dead for 80 years. This was love, this searing, torturing, intolerably sweet thing, this possession of body and soul and spirit. The poets had sung but weakly of it. He could tell them better if he could find words. Could other men have loved at all? Could any man love those blousy, common girls of